How did ancient humans find water in deserts? You are lost in a desert, and you have 11 hours of water left. Not a metaphor. 11 hours, give or take, depending on how hard the sun is working that day. You know this because you checked your bottle 40 minutes ago and did the math, and the math was not friendly. The horizon does the thing deserts do, which look identical in every direction. Like the landscape itself refuses to give you a hint. There is no app for this. There is no trail marker. There is, as far as you can tell, nothing here but sand, heat, and the specific quiet panic of realizing your body is a machine that runs on water and you are currently the one piece of evidence proving what happens when the fuel runs out. Here is the part that should bother you more than it probably will. A human being, in serious desert heat, can die from dehydration in about 3 days, sometimes less. The kidneys start failing first, quietly, then the blood thickens, then the brain, which is mostly water itself, starts losing the plot in increasingly literal ways. 3 days. That is the entire window. And yet there are populations of human beings who have lived permanently, generation after generation, in some of the driest, most punishing deserts on the planet, with no wells, no pipes, no plastic bottles, no GPS coordinates for the nearest gas station. They did not survive the desert. They lived there. They raised children there. They had birthdays there, presumably, in whatever form a birthday took for someone whose entire concept of time was the sun's position and the season's cruelty. So here is the actual question, the one that should be bothering you. If 3 days is the kill switch for a hydrated, well-fed, well-rested modern human standing next to a working faucet, how did anyone manage to make an entire life out of a landscape that seems specifically engineered to prevent exactly that? The honest answer involves watching insects with an attention span that would put most modern productivity gurus to shame, drinking liquid out of places you genuinely do not want described to you in detail, and developing a relationship with the natural world so precise it functioned less like instinct and more like an inherited engineering manual. Modern people lose their minds if they forget a water bottle at the gym. The people we are about to discuss read entire ecosystems like a map, and the map said, water, right here. Dig. This is not a story about luck. It is not a story about people who happened to stumble across the occasional oasis and got by on good fortune for 10,000 years. What you are about to hear is closer to an entire applied science, refined over countless generations, tested against the single highest stakes imaginable, and passed down with the kind of precision you would expect from people whose survival depended on getting it exactly right, every single time, with no margin for a confident guess. And it starts, strangely enough, not with humans at all. Here is the part that tends to surprise people. The single most reliable water-finding technology available to ancient desert populations was not a tool. It was not a technique they invented from scratch through trial and error. It was other animals. Consider the dung beetle, an insect that exists primarily to deal with other animals' waste, which is already a tough career, and somehow gets harder. In the Namib Desert, one of the driest places on Earth, a particular species of dung beetle climbs to the top of sand dunes at dawn and does something that looks, to a casual observer, almost meditative. It stands completely still, head down, rear end raised into the air, holding this position for stretches of time that seem deeply inefficient for an insect with places to be. What it is actually doing is harvesting fog. The beetle's shell has microscopic bumps that are hydrophilic, meaning they attract water, surrounded by waxy channels that are hydrophobic, meaning they repel it. Fog rolls in off the cold ocean current nearby, condenses on those bumps, and gets funneled directly down a channel into the beetle's mouth. The insect is, structurally, a fog harvesting machine that evolved before machines existed. Researchers studying biomimicry, the practice of stealing design ideas from nature because nature has had several 100 million more years of research and development than we have used this exact beetle as the inspiration for fog collecting nets currently deployed in water-scarce regions of Chile and Peru. The beetle figured out atmospheric water harvesting. We are still catching up. Ancient humans living alongside this kind of ecosystem were not separate observers standing outside it with a clipboard. They were embedded participants, and embedded participants noticed things. They noticed which birds flew in straight, purposeful lines at dawn and dusk, a behavior that, as it turns out, almost always means the bird is heading directly toward or away from a water source, because birds do not waste energy on a leisurely scenic route, when survival math applies to them too. They noticed which insects appeared in unusually dense concentrations, because insects cluster around moisture the way modern humans cluster around the one coffee shop with decent Wi-Fi. They noticed which plants stayed green slightly longer into a dry season than their neighbors. A small detail that, if you are paying close enough attention, tells you something is happening underground that is not happening 6 feet to the left. This is not folklore dressed up as science after the fact. This is observational data collection conducted across multiple human lifetimes, refined and corrected, and passed down, with the kind of accuracy that academic field research takes years to replicate, and ancient populations had functioning as common knowledge, before most of them had a word for the concept of a hypothesis. They were not guessing. They were running an inherited, multi-generational study, with a sample size in the millions, and the results were the difference between a family eating dinner that night and a family not existing the following season. What this means is that before you can understand how ancient humans found water in the desert, you have to abandon the idea that this was somehow primitive knowledge. It was the opposite of primitive. It was applied environmental science conducted without instruments, using nothing but sustained, disciplined attention to a landscape that most modern people would glance at for seconds before declaring it empty. There is a particular bird worth mentioning here, the sandgrouse, which lives across several of the world's driest regions, and has developed one of the more genuinely strange adaptations in the entire animal kingdom specifically for this problem. Male sandgrouse have specialized belly feathers that function almost like a sponge, capable of holding a significant volume of water. The bird will fly, sometimes distances exceeding 50 kilometers, to a known water source, wade in, soak these specialized feathers thoroughly, and fly the entire distance back to deliver water directly to chicks waiting in a nest that may be nowhere near any water source at all. This is, functionally, a bird that has turned itself into a delivery mechanism, and ancient desert populations, who observed this behavior closely enough, understood exactly what a sandgrouse flying in a determined, purposeful line at dawn actually meant. Not a bird going about random business. A bird with somewhere specific and important to be, and that specific place was, with remarkable reliability, water. Camels deserve a mention too, if only because the assumptions people carry about them tend to be slightly wrong in an instructive way. The popular idea that camels store water in their humps is, technically, not quite accurate. The hump is primarily fat storage, which the body can convert to both energy and a small amount of metabolic water when needed. But the animal's actual water efficiency comes from elsewhere, from blood cells shaped in a way that resists the kind of dehydration-related damage that would devastate a human circulatory system, and from a body temperature that is allowed to fluctuate across a wider range than most mammals would tolerate, reducing the need to sweat in order to maintain a fixed internal temperature. Ancient desert populations, who herded camels, were not simply using them as transportation. They were, in effect, partnering with a species that had already solved several of the desert's hardest problems, through several million years of its own evolutionary trial and error, and learning to read the animal's behavior as a secondary layer of environmental information, layered directly on top of their own. The instruments did eventually arrive, just not the kind you might expect. Archaeological evidence from multiple desert regions across the world shows that ancient populations did not simply observe water sources passively. They engineered access to them with a level of sophistication that regularly surprises the researchers who excavate it. Take the Qanat, an underground water channel system developed in ancient Persia roughly 3,000 years ago, which is itself a strikingly elegant solution to a brutal problem. In arid regions, water often exists underground in aquifers at the base of mountains or hills, but bringing it to where people actually live, often miles away across open desert, presents an obvious dilemma. Surface canals lose enormous amounts of water to evaporation in desert heat, which somewhat defeats the purpose. The Qanat solution was to dig a gently sloping tunnel entirely underground, connecting the water source to the settlement, with vertical shafts spaced along its length for ventilation and access. Underground, the water stayed shaded, cool, and protected from evaporation, traveling sometimes for miles with minimal loss. Some Qanats stretched over 40 kilometers. Several thousand of them, dug by hand with nothing but basic tools, and an almost unreasonable amount of confidence in geometry, are still functioning today, 3 millennia later, which is not a sentence that applies to most modern infrastructure projects. Then there is the San people of the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa, whose water knowledge represents one of the most extensively documented examples of indigenous desert survival science available to researchers. The Kalahari is not technically the driest desert on Earth, but it is dry enough that surface water can disappear for months at a time across enormous stretches of territory. The San developed a technique anthropologists refer to as the sip well, which involves locating specific plant roots, primarily a type known as the water root, that store moisture deep underground as a survival mechanism for the plant itself. The San would identify these plants by subtle surface cues, dig down sometimes several feet, extract the root, and squeeze or suck the stored moisture directly from it, sometimes using a hollow reed as a kind of organic straw. A single root could yield a genuinely useful amount of water, enough to matter, in a landscape that offered nothing else for miles. What makes this genuinely remarkable, beyond the technique itself, is the identification skill required to make it work at all. There is no obvious external sign that screams water plant here. Dig immediately. The cues are subtle. Leaf texture, stem coloration, slight variations in surface vegetation that someone without specific trained knowledge would walk directly past without a second glance. This is not a skill anyone picks up casually. It requires direct teaching, sustained practice, and the kind of generational knowledge transfer that anthropologists studying contemporary sand communities describe as functionally equivalent to an extended, immersive apprenticeship beginning in early childhood. There is also something genuinely mysterious in this picture that researchers have not fully resolved, which deserves honest acknowledgement rather than a confident answer that does not actually exist. The precision with which some indigenous desert populations locate underground water, in environments with seemingly no surface indication whatsoever, occasionally exceeds what current models of observable environmental cues can fully explain. Some researchers suspect a combination of subtle cues so minor that they have not yet been properly catalogued. Others point toward accumulated tacit knowledge passed down with a level of detail that simply has not been fully documented by outside observers, who arrive with cameras and notebooks but not generations of inherited context. We don't fully know, and that gap in our knowledge, oddly enough, makes the parts we do understand feel more credible rather than less, because it suggests we are looking at the edge of something genuinely sophisticated rather than the whole of something simple. What all of this adds up to is not a collection of clever survival tricks. It is closer to a complete applied discipline, an entire field of practical science that existed for millennia before anyone wrote a research paper about it, developed and refined by people whose only available laboratory was the desert itself, and whose only acceptable failure rate was zero. A similar story unfolds on the other side of the planet, among Aboriginal Australian communities who have occupied some of the harshest desert terrain on Earth for tens of thousands of years, longer than almost any other documented human presence in a single environment. Across the central Australian desert, communities developed and maintained networks of what are sometimes called soak wells, locations where water collects naturally just beneath the surface in specific sandy or gravelly soil types, invisible to anyone without the right knowledge, but entirely reliable to anyone who possesses it. These locations were not secrets discovered once and then simply remembered. They were actively maintained, the soil periodically cleared, the access points protected and managed across generations as genuine infrastructure, communal resources treated with the same seriousness a modern city treats its reservoir system. Equally significant is the broader category of knowledge anthropologists refer to as songlines, oral traditions that encode practical survival information, including the precise locations of water sources, into song, story, and ceremony, transmitted across vast distances and enormous stretches of time, with a level of accuracy that continues to impress researchers attempting to map them against modern satellite data. A songline is not simply folklore in the dismissive sense that word sometimes carries. It is a memory system, an oral GPS encoded into cultural practice specifically,